The God We Made, How I Got Here. I want to tell you how I arrived at monoanthrotheism, because the framework didn't come from reading philosophy. It came from trying to stay alive. I struggled with suicidal ideation for years. I'm okay now, I want to say that clearly, but there were stretches where the only thing that kept me going was anger. Not hope, not faith, anger. I'd tell myself, I'm not doing this. I'm going to die of a legitimate accident or old age, and when I get to the other side, I'm going to kick God in the dick and punch the devil in his stupid throat and tell them both what losers they are for failing to get me to take myself out. I'm not playing nice like Job. If God wants to mess with me, he'd better watch himself when I get there, because I'm going to rock his world. That sounds unhinged. I know, but it worked, and later I'd find out there was actually a framework that explained why it worked. Dr. David Hawkins mapped human consciousness onto a scale of emotional states. At the bottom, you have shame and guilt. Above that, grief. Then fear, desire, anger, pride, and then a threshold he called courage, where something shifts and genuine growth becomes possible. I didn't know the framework at the time, but I was living it. I was using anger to drag myself up out of shame and guilt far enough to keep breathing. It was exhausting, and it came out sideways sometimes, and I could never stay there. The weight I was carrying would pull me back down eventually, and the cycle would restart. But it kept me here, so I'm not apologizing for it. What changed was sobriety. When I got serious about not drinking, I couldn't run anymore. I'd get pulled back down into shame and guilt, and instead of grabbing for the anger, I'd just stay there and look around and start asking what was actually tethering me to that place. That's when the mirror showed up. I'd been studying law of attraction and manifestation. If you've spent any time in that world, you know the mirror principle. The idea is that the cosmos reflects back to you what you are. Your outer life is a projection of your inner state, which sounds clean and elegant until you're someone with a lot of problems in your life, because then it's not inspiration, it's an indictment. If the mirror principle is true, then the chaos isn't God's fault, or the devil's fault, or bad luck. It's mine. It's me, projected outward. I wasn't ready to accept that, so I sat with the resentment for a while. Then Kelly gave me the laundry. I'd come home after asking her to do one simple thing, flip the laundry, pay the dog license fees, something small, and she'd have cleaned the bathroom and detailed her car and run 1,000 errands and painted her nails, everything except the one thing I asked, and I'd be furious every time. This became a recurring argument between us, this pattern of everything but the thing I asked. Then one day, my boss asked me if I'd finished a scope of work for an upcoming project, and I started explaining how I'd been helping Mason with his stuff and handling some other requests and working on an SOP for the office, and I heard myself. I was doing exactly what Kelly did, word for word, pattern for pattern. That was the first time I really saw it. The thing that makes us most angry in other people is often the exact thing we do ourselves that causes us the most problems. The mirror wasn't cosmic, it was just honest. Once I could see that, I started deliberately looking for the things about Kelly that irritated me most, and then going and finding those same patterns in my own life and working on them. It wasn't comfortable, but it was the first time I felt like I was actually pulling out the tethers instead of just fighting against them. And then, out of nowhere, Moses hit a rock. Let me give you the full story, because you need the details to see what I saw. Earlier in the Exodus narrative, the Israelites are thirsty and complaining, which, to be fair, is what you do when you've been wandering in a desert, and God tells Moses to strike a rock with his staff. Moses does it. Water comes out, problem solved. Straightforward miracle, no drama. Later, same situation. The people are thirsty again, complaining again, but this time God tells Moses to speak to the rock, just talk to it. Moses, however, is furious at the Israelites, fed up, at the end of his rope, done with these people, and instead of speaking to the rock, he hauls off and smacks it. Twice. Hard. And this time, according to the text, blood comes out instead of water, and God punishes Moses for it, telling him he won't be allowed to enter the promised land after everything he's done to get there. Growing up, I was taught that this story was a lesson in precision obedience. God said tap it, Moses smacked it, and God doesn't tolerate that kind of sloppiness. Follow the instructions exactly or face the consequences. But I kept getting stuck on the punishment. Moses had just spent 40 years leading an extraordinarily difficult people through an extraordinarily difficult situation. He was exhausted and angry, and he hit a rock harder than he was supposed to. And God's response is to tell him he's done. No promised land for you, after everything. Think about that for a minute. If Quinn, my daughter, was tired and frustrated and overwhelmed, and she did something impulsive that wasn't quite what I asked, I would not sit her down and tell her she'd lost the reward she'd been working toward for 40 years. I'd try to find out what was going on with her. I'd parent her through it, because that's what a good parent does with a child who is struggling. And God is supposed to be the ultimate parent, the perfect father. But in this story, he parents worse than I do on my worst days. So I sat with that discomfort for a while, and then a different question occurred to me. What if God wasn't the one being a jackass? What if it was Moses? What if Moses was the one who was furious at himself, at the Israelites, at the impossible weight of leading people through a desert for 40 years? And he was either projecting that fury onto God or telling the people that God wanted certain things when it was really just him? It turns out I wasn't the first person to notice something like this. A 19th century German philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach argued that theology is really just anthropology in disguise. God, he said, is a projection of our highest qualities. We take our best attributes, magnify them to infinity, and call the result divine. It isn't God who made man in his image. It's man who made God in his. That's a solid observation. But it has a problem. If God is purely a projection of our best qualities, the gods of human civilization should be consistently wise, noble, and benevolent. A quick survey of religious history suggests otherwise. Zeus is vain and lustful. Kali wears a necklace of severed heads. Yahweh orders the slaughter of entire peoples and requires appeasement through blood sacrifice. The Aztec gods demanded a steady supply of human hearts just to keep the cosmos running on schedule. These aren't footnotes. These are the central sacred stories of sophisticated, enduring civilizations. Feuerbach was right about the projection. He just didn't go far enough. Carl Jung gives us the missing piece. Jung identified what he called the shadow, the repository of everything a person or culture can't integrate, the unacknowledged fears, the unprocessed shame, the rage that has nowhere acceptable to go. The shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It goes underground and runs you from there, in ways that feel like external compulsion rather than internal choice. When a culture projects outward onto the divine, it doesn't filter the shadow out first. It projects the whole psyche, the noble parts and the broken parts and everything in between. A civilization organized around conquest projects a God who demands violence. A culture built on shame projects a God who must be endlessly appeased. A people who have lived for generations under capricious, punishing authority structures project a God who is capricious and punishing. The wrathful God isn't an anomaly in the projection theory. He's the shadow wearing a crown and calling itself holy. Did you catch that? The shape of a culture's God is a pretty accurate map of that culture's unexamined wounds. You want to know what a civilization is most afraid of, most ashamed of, most unable to look at directly? Don't read their philosophers. Read their scriptures. I went looking for that pattern across the rest of the Old Testament. It was everywhere. I looked at other religious traditions. Same pattern. The gods aren't revealing themselves to us. We're building them out of our best qualities and our worst ones, out of our hopes and our unprocessed wounds, out of everything we can't bear to look at directly. I couldn't find a name for this pattern anywhere. So I built one. Mono, because the mechanism is consistent across every culture. It's one phenomenon, not many. Anthro, because the source is human consciousness. Theism, because what gets projected takes the form of gods. Monoanthrotheism. It's not atheism. I'm not saying the experiences aren't real or that the people who built these traditions were naive. The experiences are real. The patterns described in religious language are often genuinely accurate observations about human psychology. What I'm challenging is the direction of attribution. The source isn't out there, it's in here. It always was. I still find the teachings of Jesus compelling. I left evangelical Christianity because the interpretive inconsistencies became impossible for me to hold, but I never stopped sitting with what he actually said. The framework doesn't require me to throw that away, it just relocates it. And the anger that kept me alive all those years, that was real too. I was projecting onto a God I needed to be furious at because I couldn't yet afford to turn the mirror on myself. The framework doesn't shame me for that. It just explains it. The cosmos wasn't messing with me. I was messing with me. And once I could see that clearly enough, once sobriety gave me the stillness to look, I could start doing something about it. And this isn't ancient history. Right now, in real time, one of the most well-armed nations on earth is engaged in the systematic displacement and killing of a civilian population. And the theological justification on offer is that God promised them the land. A specific God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who apparently drew borders and issued deeds, and is now, several thousand years later, still collecting on the arrangement. I want to be careful here because the framework requires it. This is not a statement about Jewish people. Judaism is a rich, ancient, and varied tradition that contains within it serious voices of dissent against exactly what I'm describing. What I'm talking about is a political project that has annexed divine authority to justify territorial ambition, which is one of the oldest moves in the human playbook. But here's the question monoanthrotheism forces us to ask: which God exactly? Because if the God of Abraham promised the land to one group and Allah promised adjacent territory to another group, and, for the sake of making the logic visible, the Lenape people found a buried manuscript tomorrow promising New Jersey to them, we would have 3 competing divine real estate claims with no neutral arbiter and a lot of people with weapons. At some point, someone has to ask, what if the promise didn't come from outside? What if the promise came from the same place Moses got his instructions when he hit the rock too hard, from the interior of a human being or a human community, projecting its deepest needs and ambitions outward onto the cosmos and calling the result the Word of God? That's not a comfortable question. It wasn't comfortable for me when the mirror principle first pointed it back at my own life either. But the framework doesn't let you apply it selectively. If Moses was projecting, so is everyone else. If my shadow can dress itself up as divine instruction, so can a nation's. The wound and the justification arrive in the same package. They always have. That's where monoanthrotheism came from. Not from a library, from a laundry room in a desert and a lot of years of staying angry enough to stay alive.